Good afternoon, everyone, and a big thank you to Vikram and to EPEC for inviting me here and for the chance to take part in this symposium and to reflect, I think, on the influence that the minimum cost housing group has had in my career. And also I would like to talk about after I finished my PhD, I moved to London to work at the Development Planning Unit at University College London. So I'd like to have the chance to reflect a little bit on situating the minimum cost housing group within other education and research programs and units and departments that are working on sort of similar issues. Starting from kind of the same starting point or same influences, I think. So I've been fortunate enough to work there in London after leaving here in Montreal. So I'd like to do sort of the first part of the presentation. I'm just going to reflect a little bit on the minimum cost housing group and its influence on my career, and then the second part a little bit on the development planning unit. So first of all, why did I want to study at the minimum cost housing group, and what did I do when I was here? So I came from I did an undergraduate degree in urban studies at Concordia University, and I was quite interested. There was a couple of things particularly that interested me, I think, when I was studying there, these sort of textbooks and the professors focusing one on development issues, especially in low-income countries. And I was very interested in how people, particularly how they house themselves, how people access livelihoods and things like that. And I was also very influenced by a geography course I had taken on disasters. And being part of the urban studies program at Concordia, I had written my undergraduate dissertation on integrating exercise facilities for dogs into urban parks. Having lived in Montreal for a number of years and had a dog, I was quite interested in these planning issues. And like you're laughing, many of my professors also thought it was a very strange topic, but in fact, I ended up working after I finished my this thesis for Jeremy Searle, who is a city councillor in NDG and at the time, and was quite interested in this particular problem in his parks. And the interesting thing is, when I visit NDG, as my mom lives in NDG, when I visit now, there's a lot of integration of dogs into parks, into NDG, through different kinds of facilities. So I was quite interested in the sort of influence that planning can have. And also, my dad had a company at the time that made tents, some sort of temporary housing, and I was quite interested in this sort of temporariness, the provision of housing and things like that. So these all came together when I was offered a place at the minimum cost housing group by Vikram. I think I came to talk to him. I was undecided about various things, and he sort of said, well, I think you can explore a lot of the things that you're interested in here. And when I started at McGill, there was a earthquake in Turkey. This was in 1999, so I was here in 1999 and 2000. And I immediately wanted to understand the housing situation and how people would be able to recover and rebuild their housing. So along with working with a number of, we did a lot of interesting things that year. We worked in Ganawage, which was very interesting understanding of housing issues in indigenous communities. I went to Turkey and looked at the temporary housing. I couldn't find my full final thesis, but I looked particularly at this kind of restarting, which is what I call temporary housing, which is the restarting of daily activities after a disaster, and how those kind of things, how the different provisions of housing would enable people to do that. So I'm going a bit quickly here, but I wanted to know, then I also like to talk about how the minimum cost housing group has impacted on the future work I did after I left here at McGill, which was a short year and a half. I think the program was a year and a half. I was offered a place at Université de Montréal to do my PhD with Gonzalo Lizarralde, thank you. And we worked together with, at the same time with Professor Colin Davidson, and I worked on the same issues, I think, that I had started to look at here, which was around housing, and developed my PhD on that. We also did a lot of work together with Colin and Gonzalo, who I'd met here at the Minimum Cost Housing Group, looking at, we both were working on rebuilding after disasters. We started an international network called IREC, which is still going, that looks at reconstruction professionals. And we did a lot of work coming out of, I think, our focus on housing that we took up to Université de Montréal. And we looked at, and for example, this was a paper that we published looking at the role of community participation in post-disaster housing projects, sort of questioning this, how participation actually impacts on reconstruction projects. And when I finished my PhD, I ended up working at the Development Planning Unit. And I think that the focus on housing that the Minimum Cost Housing Group sort of brought to me, this focus on developing countries and on housing, has continued throughout my work. And I'll come back and talk about DPU in just a moment. But when I moved to London and started working on sort of similar, because working in a sort of similar department, graduate department, we worked in a number of I've been there now almost since 2006, so quite a long time. And we've worked on a lot of issues around the world that are sort of, I would say, similar to a lot of the concerns of the Minimum Cost Housing Group. The first thing I did when I moved to DPU was working in a community in Istanbul called Sürükle, which was under threat of eviction, and worked with my students there. We had gone there and spent 2 years working, not 2 years, but two sort of studio periods working with the community there, who was unfortunately eventually evicted. But I think part of the work that we did have an impact on the sort of struggle against the evictions at that time. I also did a lot of work on evictions in general. Other things on this piece of work, we looked at how community groups and individuals who are facing eviction, what are the kinds of resistance things that they do, and looked in a number of places across the world on that. And also on the topic of evictions, we've looked at particularly the problem of how resettlement is used as a kind of tactic for disaster risk reduction, and saying, people are at risk, so we have to move them, etc. So this is happening across the world. So we were looking at that with a number of organizations. And I've done a number of other, I think, pieces of work that are very sort of, it really quite changed my life, I think, the Minimum Cost Housing Group, in terms of how I was going to be seeing things. And this was also accommodated through a lot of work that I've done at the Development Planning Unit. And just because I'm running out of time, I'm going to go to talk about the Development Planning Unit a bit and some reflections on the similarities and differences. And I think that the DPU kind of at the same time, earlier than the Minimum Cost Housing Group, but came out of the same ideas of looking particularly at housing, at sort of different ways that we can, from the predominant top-down model of housing provision, and looking at how people access housing. And I think both the Minimum Cost Housing Group and the DPU have been quite influential in those fields. Certainly, I think housing has been a common concern of the Development Planning Unit over a long period of time. And for example, John Turner, who many of you who studied at housing will know his work, he was at the DPU for some time, and started short courses on housing. We've never had a master's program on housing, but we've had a lot of short courses on housing. And a lot of this is sort of some of the staff that's retired now from the DPU. But we've also done quite a few. We had in the DPU 60, which was actually 10 years ago now, we're on DPU 70. We did a reflection on, what are some of the roles of the history basically that we've had, and what are some of the sort of concepts and ideas and how they've influenced them. So it's quite an interesting way to explore, I think, the history of the institution. But essentially, okay, thank you. Essentially, it's also a department that's been teaching on the sort of master's level programs, and we teach 7 different programs that have to do with development planning. So it's not architecture; it's more on the planning side of things. But I think that it's different in that we kind of use the same methods of trying to bring to light the way that we see the world and trying to show the kinds of injustices that are there. And I think that the minimum cost housing has done that through a much more architectural form, whereas the DPU does it through a more sort of planning focused and capacity building focused. Right? Yeah. Thank you very much.